Okay, so I just wanted to introduce our presenters tonight. Shayna Mccaw and Brent Bloodsberg are a collaborative team with a 20-year history working in sculpture, performance, photography, and film. Their work explores history as a malleable medium that has, and continues to be, molded to fit the perceptions of the storyteller. Scale models of rural architectural forms are a recurring subject in their work, and through these, they examine the psychology of place, ancestral memory, and the passage of time. More recently, Mccaw and Bloodsberg have also been performing for the camera, using photography and video to document the labors of two pioneer-era homesteaders. They are also co-founders of Current Projects, a design and fabrication studio that draws influence from the tools and techniques of the past while maintaining a contemporary perspective that is informed by their work as artists. In addition to managing Current Projects, Bloodsberg is the exhibition designer for the Chipstone Foundation and has created exhibitions at Linden Sculpture Garden, the Milwaukee Art Museum, the John Michael Kohler Arts Center, and the Museum of Wisconsin Art, among other places. Mccaw is the senior curator at the Villa Terrace and Charles Allis Art Museums in Milwaukee. The two received the Mary L. Knoll Fellowship for Individual Artists in the established category in both 2008 and 2014, and a Fellowship.Art Accelerator grant in 2018. They also have been they've had solo exhibitions recently, as well as been part of a number of group exhibitions. In 2011, the two were in residence in Utah with the Center for Land Use Interpretation, and in 2012, they spent time at the Goldwell Open Air Museum in Nevada for a residency near Death Valley. Their book of photographs, entitled States of Matter, is now part of the collection at the Nevada Museum of Art's Center for Art and Environment. I'm delighted to welcome them both here tonight.
Thanks. Should we take it away and share our screen?
Yes, please.
Okay. All right, I'm going to hit the share screen button. Here we go. Okay, share. And then make it big. Make it big.
Right here.
Make a big button.
There we go.
Okay. Can you see our screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay,
great.
All right. So, first slide. So Brent and I kind of thought it would be nice to, in a way, this is somewhat chronological. So it kind of traces our history working in the public realm in different ways. And we decided to title this talk Adventures in Public Art, because I think it'll be kind of fun to share with you guys some of the successes and failures, or maybe I shouldn't even use the word failure because you're always learning from your failures, but some of the strange things that happened along the way that we definitely have learned from, and you know, it helped develop our work. So this first slide is of the first performance art group we formed called the White Box Painters. And this has a history going back to around
2000.
Yeah, 2000. And it's kind of like expanded and contracted in terms of the number of members, but the four core members that are in this picture are Harvey Opgenorth, Mark Escribano. Those two are located in LA now, and then me and Brent, and we're here in Milwaukee. And so we have collaborated over a distance in more recent years after they moved to LA, but it hasn't been, it was much easier to collaborate when we all lived in Milwaukee, of course.
Yeah, in some ways, this is our origin story as well as collaborators. We've done a fair amount of work that's outside the public realm, that's in galleries and whatnot. But some of our first projects together were these collaborative projects with the White Box Painters.
Yeah, go ahead. This was an early project, and one thing I was going to say about the White Box Painters is there's very, very simple parameters for all the projects they do. They're kind of people who, once they put on their white coveralls and they become these white box painters, they really only understand two things: white paint and cubes or boxes. So the first the first public art installation that was also interactive and performative that we did was, this one is called Hopscotch, and it was a 6-block long hopscotch that basically connected, I think, about 4 different galleries in the River West area that all had openings on the same night. And we were actually kind of commissioned to create some sort of performance that would connect them. And so this is the idea we came up with. And we basically just created a kind of a square template, and we spent the day painting this on the sidewalk. We didn't tell anyone this, but we did come up with a paint formula that was going to wash away as soon as it rained. So we weren't really interested in creating something permanent. And while we were creating the hopscotch, we realized that even though it wasn't necessarily a primary intention, we were performing while we were creating this installation. So that was kind of the first aha moment that, oh yeah, like this is not only an installation that's going to be interactive, we are performing. And that made us think a lot more about our persona as these sort of municipal worker type people.
Right. At this point, we were not yet known as the White Box Painters. We just were doing this installation as artists, and we brought together a group of people to do it. And when we sort of realized that we were performing, even though we were sort of primarily thinking of it more of a public installation, we started thinking a little bit more about who we were. And that's when we sort of gave ourselves this moniker of the White Box Painters, and continued to do projects along those lines, using those very narrow parameters of projects that engage with white paint and drawing squares. And it seemed like sort of prohibitively narrow parameters, but it proved to be very fruitful in terms of all of the different directions we could go with it. And early on, we were doing more projects kind of along those same lines, where we were painting on the street. This one is actually almost the same intersection where that last one was shown. This is outside a gallery called Flux Gallery, not related to Flux Design.
No, it's no longer there.
It's on Center Street. And these early public performance pieces were not sanctioned exactly. They were kind of guerrilla performance pieces. So this one was done kind of in a busy intersection, and we didn't block off the street. We didn't get permission. We just sort of ran out in the middle of the street, had someone watching for cars, and we would very quickly paint a square as quickly as we could without getting run over.
And it was, and this was pretty interesting because cars did drive over our wet paint and kind of smear it around and stuff. So in a way, we were interacting with the traffic as performers as well. And then we did actually attempt to hold a human game of checkers on this, but you can imagine how kind of ill-advised that was, because everybody would come out and then have to run away when some cars went by and then try to remember where they were. But still, it didn't really work, but it was a really fun adventure.
Yeah, in some ways we were young and naive, but that I think is what makes these pieces interesting in some ways. I think the other thing is the world was a little bit more naive. And one thing we noticed was, or I think about a lot, is that this was actually pre 9/11. And I feel like we tried to do some projects along these lines post 9/11. And it's just like the world was like, the cops were all over it, and we just got shut down. And it just, I think a lot of things changed in just the mindset. And I think it had something to do with that event. But
do you remember when that happened, the chessboard that you did?
That was maybe just a year or two after the first one. So it was probably in 2001 or 2002.
Okay, thank you.
Well,
yeah.
It was either 2000 or 2001, I think. It was pre 9/11.
So this piece, actually right behind us on the wall here is a framed version of this drawing. This is actually a photograph with drawing back into it. It's a proposal drawing for a piece that was a lot more sanctioned, so to speak, because it was for a project called My Vote Performs.
But still perhaps ill-advised.
Still perhaps ill-advised. You can decide. But in 2008, during the presidential elections, this group called My Vote Performs was organizing performance art at various polling locations. And so we got to use this site. It's the town of Lake Water Tower. It's a polling site, but it's also think sort of like a municipal office building, and it has offices and stuff inside it. And so we proposed these 2 enormous Jacob's ladders that would hang down on the front of the building, and then we would be activating them to make them sort of flip and cascade over and over. And the piece was called The Tally, and it was simply meant to kind of represent the idea of votes being cast. We weren't saying one half was, the Republican votes and one half was the Democrat votes, but more just that idea of a vote getting cast and another one getting cast, and just that sort of tallying process. And so it was kind of an abstract gesture, but again, we did it as in character as the white box painters. So we're going to show you just a little clip. This video is like 7 minutes long, but we'll just show you a little clip because it does a good job of showing you kind of how the action progressed during the day. It's all kind of sped up.
So this was kind of this amazing opportunity to work with a really just kind of a beautiful building. It's sort of a works progress era Art Deco water tower. And so it really was a privilege to use this as a backdrop. And I think we started developing our personas a little bit more as the white box painters, and we really were thinking about these sort of municipal workers, people who set up barricades out on the street and wear vests and hard hats and
carry clipboards,
and go about various repairs and things like that. And I think it was really interesting that we tend to sort of I think let those people kind of fade into the background and ignore them to a degree. And we sort of experienced that when we played those personas, because a lot of people who were coming to vote really actually literally thought we were working on the building. Like some of them didn't even really look up to see these enormous sculptures that were activated and hanging off of the side of the building. People are asking us why we were painting on a day that we were voting. And I think in the end it was, we kind of questioned some things about whether it was appropriate, and I think in hindsight, I think it was a beautiful sort of abstract gesture and a poetic piece. And I think it was visually stunning and playful. But I think, in the end, we kind of did sort of question whether it was appropriate, because I think that voting is sort of a sacred activity. And if there's any possibility that what we were doing was intimidating to the voters
or
confusing, I think that that's perhaps crossing a line.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we talk about our adventures and misadventures, I think part of it is the lessons we learn from these projects. Mm-hmm. But I do believe in taking these risks too, because it's how you learn and move forward. I love the piece, I really do. It's just sometimes I question whether it was perfectly appropriate. And the thing that really makes me question it has to do with the next slide. And we got in a little bit of trouble for this one. So this photograph was taken from a helicopter, and we really wanted to document the piece. We thought of it as this kind of epic piece, and so we wanted to get good documentation of it. So we actually hired a photographer to photograph it from the air in a helicopter. Now, when we set that up, we imagined kind of what you would see with like a traffic helicopter, where there's a helicopter hovering way up there and you kind of don't even notice it. And the photographer and pilot had a slightly different idea. And so they continually tried to get the perfect shot and swooped very close down to the polling site and made quite a disruption. And we were trying to communicate with them and call them off via cell phone, but of course they couldn't hear the phone ring because they were in a helicopter. The organizer was not very happy with us about that either. So
no, and actually, interesting side note, this also goes back to the 9/11 thing that we were bringing up, was that the organizer of the performance event actually got a call from Homeland Security, because this water tower actually is near some water reservoirs, and so having a helicopter swoop that close really set off alarms that somebody was doing some sort of surveillance of the water system or something. after a couple of days of them researching the project, they realized it wasn't a threat, but we were kind of on pins and needles for a couple of days.
Yeah, we actually cleared like whether it was legal to fly and on you know, the voting day and everything, and that was all legal. It was the location, the fact that it was a water tower, that actually was problematic, and it did trigger a Homeland Security investigation. So we can check that box. All right, moving on. So another project we did with the White Box Painters is this project called Sisyphus. We were invited to participate in a arts festival in Calgary, and the theme of the festival that year was truth and lies. And so we sort of made up this kind of monumental lie, which was that we would be pushing this enormous cube from Milwaukee to Calgary. And so we made this little video showing the cube being pushed through various landscapes.
Okay, so that the city that it ended up in at the end of that video was Calgary. Like Brent said, we were invited to do a kind of final performance in the city at the gallery that was sponsoring the event. Or no, I guess it wasn't sponsoring the event. It was a citywide event, but it was a participating gallery. And and then one thing that also has always been really important to us when we're working with the White Box Painters is documentation. So we are not only often building an installation and creating these objects that we're going to interact with, and then there's a performance element. There's also always a documentation element. So we have one of the White Box Painters, Mark Escribano. He's a filmmaker, and he's all along the way with these projects. He's always gotten really fantastic film footage and video footage, and then photographs. So we have quite a trove of imagery, to work with, and we've done lots of different things with them. I mean, when you have that type of imagery, you can obviously put together really interesting slide presentations and things like that, but you can also turn them into books, and we've posted them online on blogs, and we've done other things with them. So it's actually sort of something that I think has carried into almost all the work we've done, is we always make an effort to get really good documentation of these things. So these are just a couple other pictures.
Before, I don't know if you can see my cursor here. I think you can. It's screen share, right? So before you move on, just take note of this structure right here. That will become important later in this lecture. Okay.
Yeah, and that's the first time we encountered that structure, or maybe the only time, but first time we reference it. Here's a few other images.
So the lie part of this, of course, was that we actually had the cube in the back of our van, and what we would do is we basically drove there without a plan of where we were going to go, and we just stopped along the way at places we thought would be interesting to shoot, and we found some really amazing locations and had some amazing experiences. So it was a really interesting adventure.
Yeah, the image on, well, whatever side it's on for you, with the church, that's actually in Nebraska. That church looks like an adobe structure almost, but it's surprising to me that they found that in Nebraska. And then the other one was from Glacier National Park. There had been a fire there.
Yeah.
So yeah, so it's just really a beautiful range of landscapes.
So here it is, the final performance in the city, where we're pushing it through the streets of Calgary. And then you can see in the lower right, there's the gallery installation. You can see all the wear and tear the cube has taken along the way. It's pretty beat up. But in each of those TVs or monitors that surrounded the cube, each one of those had a scene that corresponded to some of the scenes you saw in that initial video, only they weren't sped up. And we had it coordinated in such a way that my character, who was pushing the cube, would push through one screen, and then it'd wait a while. And then you'd see him emerge again in the next screen in a different landscape. And then you'd wait a while, and then it would emerge in the next one. And so there was literally all these different videos that were coordinated so that my character would kind of circumnavigate the cube over and over again in a loop.
So this is kind of moving us away from some of the white box painters' work. That project has slowed down a little bit, like I said, because we have 2 of our members in another city at this point. So another project that we did recently that had kind of a public component, it's sort of a public/private component in a way, but it's this piece called T. And it actually is an acronym that stands for Transitory Experiment in Association. Also T, it literally is a tea party. We did this as part of a exhibition at the former Innova Gallery that was called Cargo Space. And basically what the premise of the project was that we create these tea events with 6 people. Brent and I are there, and then we invite 4 other people. And we don't know who is going to be at this party. So we try to have other people invite the attendees so that we don't really have any role in it. So this initial group, I believe, was made up of people involved in the Cargo Space project.
Right, correct.
So that's the first group that you're seeing here. And we are in the middle of the gallery in the Cargo Space exhibition for this first round.
And then the way we determined who the next guests were is each one of those guests was allowed to invite another guest for the following one. Mm-hmm. So there's this sort of interesting process that takes place, you can move on, where each new iteration, it starts with a circle of people we know, or at least we're associated with through that exhibit. But then there becomes another degree of separation with each iteration of T. And so it was interesting. So for the first several, we knew, at least some of the people at the table, and then it would kind of branch out from there. Mm-hmm. And it was kind of a way of bringing people together to sit down and converse and have we had snacks and stuff too. So like eat together, who are from, diverse different backgrounds and are not necessarily people who would come together on their own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and because it started in an art context, we have always done it in an art context. So we did it at the Haggerty Museum, just in the middle of their exhibition, whatever was up at the time. Here, we're at the Pitch Project, the former Pitch Project, in the middle of an exhibition, and then the other one is at Linden Sculpture Garden outside. And we always bring our own table and chairs and that chandelier. So it was kind of a good challenge to have the chandelier hanging and lit at Linden. And this project, after the Linden iteration, kind of went on hiatus, but Brent and I have been talking recently about kind of reinvigorating this project and starting it up again.
Did you, I'm sorry, yeah. Can I interrupt you? Did you do those tea gatherings during the hours that the places were operating so that people would be around?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
so there was kind of an element of us performing for the visitors to the gallery too. I will say we usually were just sort of weirdly, it wasn't really intentional, but we kind of ended up doing it at tea time, so like kind of mid-afternoon, and most of the spaces we were at weren't really crowded during that time anyway, but we usually consulted with the gallery on a good time to do it. So
yeah, and it's interesting because then the guests become performers too, which maybe puts them in a slightly awkward position, but I think that creates an interesting tension.
Mm-hmm. So this photograph is from the residency that Sarah mentioned in Death Valley, or it was actually just near Death Valley, very, very near Death Valley. So each day that we went out to do our work, which was basically videography and photographing, we would, drive into Death Valley and spend our time in that area. And so we went out there with the intention of taking photographs of ourselves, mostly portraits of ourselves in character as these kind of 19th century pioneers. But one of the days we decided to do this kind of unannounced performance. There's this one area of Death Valley that's a pretty large sand dune. It's a few miles across. It's not the entire Death Valley. We kind of went out there with this naive idea that all of Death Valley looked like the Sahara Desert or something, but it turns out it's just one small area that really has the iconic dunes. So, and it's obviously a huge tourist attraction. So anytime we went out there, it was just crawling with people all over the dunes and having a great time. So we decided if we wanted to photograph in that location, we kind of just had to embrace the fact that it was full of people. And so we decided to do an unannounced performance where Brent, in character as his 19th century kind of pioneer, would walk across the dunes and kind of act, in that sort of stereotypical way that you see in a lot of Westerns from the 40s and the 50s, where someone is lost in the desert and they're staggering around and they have only a drop of water left in their canteen.
Yeah, we're all familiar with the story. It's sort of a Hollywood trope, that shows up over and over again. And it often happens literally here because this is the closest desert to Hollywood. And so when you see a desert, whether it's in a movie, whether it's on Earth or on another planet, it's very often filmed here because it's the most convenient place to film. And so they'll often, shoot from low angles. So all those mountains in the background will be gone and it'll just feel like endless dunes. If they need to erase footprints, they bring in a helicopter as an eraser, and they just like blow all the sand around. So that was interesting.
So just as a quick caption to this picture, this is just the start of the performance. You can see Brent is getting out of our rental car and just kind of getting ready. And then he basically just takes off across the dunes. And this ended up being one of the most iconic photographs from the performance because of those two people there who are looking at Brent with really the perfect expression. They're just like, wait, what is happening? And it's really, really great because Brent's character or his costume and everything sort of lends to I guess the suspension of disbelief that you maybe are really looking at someone from that era. He fits so well into that environment, but then on the other side of the photo are modern people. So it's really it's hard to reconcile, I think, both of the things that you're seeing in this picture. So, and I was the videographer and photographer for the day. So I spent my time running around trying to get different angles of Brent and different, I would shoot video and then I'd run over and shoot still photos. And that was actually really, really hard to do. And we kind of realized later that we probably should have just done one or the other instead of trying to capture both.
And we were both sick. So
yes, we both had colds.
Remember colds? Okay. Okay, so then the next project we're going to show you, this is actually not a Shayna and Brent project, but it's a Faux Wilson project. So I work as the exhibition designer for the Chipstone Foundation. And Faux Wilson approached us to work with her on a project called Eliza's Peculiar Cabinet of Curiosities at Linden Sculpture Garden. And so she came to us with this model and with kind of a description of the project and asked us to work with her on doing the build out. And so this, the project kind of revolves around this character named Eliza, who was an enslaved girl who collected all sorts of things and hid them in the cabin where she lived. And so essentially our task was to create this kind of somewhat abstracted, reinterpreted, reimagined version of a former slave dwelling. So as part of the preparation for this project, we actually, Shayna and I did a tour of the southeast and looked at all of the remaining, still existing slave dwellings that we could find. So there are still some of these that still stand. And one of the things that was very interesting about this was the construction. I mean, that's kind of what we were tasked with. So I was looking very closely at that and how they were built. And this sort of sparked an interest in timber framing for us. Because for the most part, these were timber frame structures, and they were often timber framed by hand using what appeared to be without using measuring tools in the same way we would do it today. There's a lot of things that were sort of seemed to be measured just based on the body or based on sort of like estimating or marking from one piece to another. And so I found that really, really fascinating. This is what we ended up building. And so it is sort of an abstracted, half kind of exploded version of a small sort of timber frame structure that was based on many different examples of former slave dwellings. And we made it using traditional mortise and tenon joinery using white oak. And then the roof is cedar. This shows a few of the details of different aspects of the structure and some of the more playful gestures as well, such as this kind of unexplained ladder that penetrates the roof. And I think what was really interesting about this piece and kind of influential for us was that on one hand, it was an installation and it sort of told a story, talked about these different issues. But the other intention behind this was that Faux designed this as a stage, as a platform for other artists to respond to and kind of use in a very diverse number of different ways. So there's a program called the Call and Response program, and I'll just read this from the Linden Sculpture Garden website that kind of describes how they're using the installation. Working with artists, scholars, educators, and community members, we've been imagining a space for artists of color working across disciplines to celebrate the radical Black imagination in both form and content. Reggie Wilson's 2015 residency and performance Moses and Faux Wilson's Eliza's Peculiar Cabinet of Curiosities have redefined Linden as a place where Black creativity is nurtured and celebrated, and where its role as a unique technology of Black agency, resistance, and survival is being explored. With Call and Response, we expand these conversations into other marginalized communities that are actively addressing citizenship and belonging in their daily lives. And I think what was really gratifying for me about being a part of this project was coming back to it year after year and seeing these different performances and all these different interpretations and responses to this piece, and really getting the sense that the project had transformed from being a sort of artwork and an installation into like really being a place. And it's sort of a place that kind of accumulated meaning and content with every new iteration of what happened there. So for us, I think that was really influential, and it in some ways has steered the direction of some of the other projects we're thinking about now.
Yeah, such as this one. This one is called the Tenuous Framework, and we were invited by Ripon College, the art department there, to do a show in their indoor gallery, but then we also wanted to do an installation out in their prairie restoration area that's just right behind the college. And so we built this, you can tell we were really influenced by, working with Faux on the timber framing project and just thinking about the framing of these buildings. And so we wanted to build basically the final piece was always meant to be kind of a half constructed building. So it was, when you saw it, you were supposed to think that it was still in progress. This also, we kind of have a history as well of working with scale models. And this is a farmhouse structure that we've been using in our work for years and years. But this is a, what, 1/4 scale?
Yeah, about half scale.
Half scale version of it. So we still haven't ever built the farmhouse full scale. Keep scaling it in other ways, really tiny and not quite so tiny. And so this always was intended to be something that kind of developed over time. So we did go out to the prairie several times and kind of add to it as though it was continuing to be built. And then we are continuing to work on this film project as well, where we're filming ourselves in character as 19th century pioneer characters. And then we're building a lot of sets in order to do that film work on. So this is one of those sets that we ended up shooting.
And so this is sort of served multiple purposes. And so for us, it's a film set. It's a companion piece to something we did in the gallery, but it is also public sculpture in that this is a sort of prairie area where there's trails. So it's something you might encounter while you're walking those trails. It was sort of, as Shayna said, it was sort of intended to be an unfinished project. So it was sort of designed as an abandoned project in some ways. And time really kind of helped us with that, and weather. So you can see it here after it's been standing for probably 1.5 years or so. Maybe the one on the right is maybe two years. And you can see that time and weather has taken its toll. The material is grayed and it's beginning to collapse.
Part of the reason it was up for so long is because we did intend for it. The prairie restoration always has a burn off every spring where they sort of like deliberately set a wildfire to go through there and just burn everything down. And we wanted our structure to be part of that fire and actually get charred or burnt or whatever was going to happen during the fire. But the first year it was called off, I think, because just wrong weather conditions. So we were allowed to keep it up for one whole more year to see if they do the burn in the next summer, next spring. So yeah, it had a lot of time to fall apart, which in our minds was really good. Yeah. So then we finally did get the burn, and this is the burn happened. So they have to wait for the right conditions, and then they just flip a switch and they say, we're doing it. And so we had to
Do we have a day's notice, or was it that day?
I don't even know if we had a day's notice. So we all just had to show up.
Cameraman together. We were at a residency at the Kohler Arts Center at the time, so we had obligations there, and we just dropped everything and went.
Yeah.
And we were able to get really excellent footage of it. It became a sort of a centerpiece of the film we're working on.
Yeah.
And
this is just a still from the film. So.
Yeah. Remarkably, the structure survived, which it was not our intention. We thought it would be destroyed, but it did get sort of charred, and we've shown it in various iterations since then in gallery settings.
Yeah, so it still lives on. Actually, we still have it, and we might keep working with it.
So speaking of destroyed structures, this is my parents' garage in Waupaca, Wisconsin, and this is after a windstorm and it's probably a 200-year-old tree. We were told it was 300. We, kind of thought maybe that wasn't feasible because I think that area was logged. But it was a 36-inch diameter white pine tree. Came down in a windstorm and absolutely obliterated their garage. I had a conversation with my dad about it, and they were having it cleared away, but they still had the tree. And we talked about, well, what should we do? Should we have it hauled away? And I was like, well, maybe we should have it milled. And we then got an opportunity. We got a phone call from Sculpture Milwaukee, from Mary Lou Knode, and we were invited to do a piece for Sculpture Milwaukee. And after the Eliza, the Faux Wilson project at Linden Sculpture Garden, we had really been itching to do another timber frame structure. And so I called my dad back up and I said, we need that tree and we need to mill it into timbers. And so from that tree was born, and here we are milling the tree. From that tree was born this idea of this piece called Skew. And we've long been fascinated with sort of how architecture fails and sort of the geometry of how architecture fails in the countryside. And you'll see this picture on the left here. That's that picture I pointed, or that site I pointed out before from the White Box Painters Project Sisyphus. And so that was probably one of the first moments when we were really starting to pay attention to those sort of odd geometries that happen from when structures fail. And so we wanted to do another timber frame project, but also challenge ourselves. And we had been working for a while at this point with current projects, and I had kind of a crack team of like really, seasoned woodworkers at our studio, and we were all up for a challenge. So we decided to create this version of a timber framed structure that was skewed 20 degrees in two directions, and to build all of the joinery and everything at those skewed angles. So it was an extremely challenging project, and also kind of resulted in a rather sort of uncanny and bizarre piece. So rather than it being sort of true to the way a structure would fail, where the joints would come apart, we did our distortions digitally, and then we're actually sort of faithful to the geometry that showed up through those digital distortions, and translated that back into the reality of the form we created. So it was this interesting kind of mix of something familiar from the rural landscape, and also like a sort of new kind of digital paradigm of way of seeing the world, which created, I think, these really interesting distortions. Let me see if I can figure out. Okay. So here we are. This is Alec, Regan, Joseph, Thrasher. Both of them are still working with us at current projects. And here's some images of them working on some of the rather complex joinery involved in the piece. This is at Alec's studio. And then I think Brock Toft is in here too. He was working with us at the time. A couple more images of it coming together in the studio. What's interesting about timber framing is it kind of goes together almost as a kit. So we actually put the whole thing together. We wouldn't have been able to get this out the door. So the whole thing went together in the studio, and then we took it all apart into pieces again, loaded up in the back of the van, put it together on site.
But that also gave us another kind of performance opportunity in a way. I mean, we weren't, dressed in costume or anything, but the assembling of the piece on site was definitely something that passersby were stopping to kind of watch for a while. And so I think if we do some more work like this in the future, we'll probably consider that a lot more.
Yeah, and so, and then we also had this base fabricated. So it's a powder-coated steel base that also was skewed in the same manner as the structure itself. And here's a couple images. You can see how the view of it is extremely dynamic and changes depending on your vantage point. And so it's a really sort of magical and odd and strange piece in that way. So you can see the very different character it takes on from different vantage points. This is a wonderful picture by Kevin Miyazaki. I love this picture. It just shows, it's almost hidden, it's almost camouflaged. You almost don't know it's there, but once you see it, it really highlights the contrast between that sort of strange geometric form against this very sort of grid-like backdrop of the city.
Yeah, and then I know we only have a couple more minutes, but we thought we would tell you a little bit about this project that we were just getting off the ground. We were at the point of really planning the fabrication and really starting to program it. This is a platforming project, so it was meant to be something that a structure that would be activated by performance groups and other types of people coming in to hold events. And this was planned for the DNC. This was actually supposed to happen Actually, before everything got shut down for both the pandemic and then later the DNC itself got canceled, we were just at the point of kind of trying to home in on the perfect location for this, because I know there was some security perimeter discussions going on, whether we could be inside or outside the security perimeter and the pros and cons, but we never got far enough in the discussion to really have to, hash all of that out. But basically, the sort of working title for this piece is the North Star Pavilion. And it's meant to, like I said, it's meant to be a pavilion that people can gather at and that different types of events can be held. And so we were starting to collaborate with a number of different groups.
Yeah, and we were working, this project was a collaboration between Shayna and I and Monica Miller of Facilitating Situations. And so she was, we often take on the building aspect of these things, and we're very interested in the programming and the content that takes place. But oftentimes we'll collaborate with someone else too, who really has an expertise in that. And so she was working on developing programming for it. And the sort of, part of this is creating an atmosphere, a sort of open, kind of welcoming atmosphere that is a sort of an intimate venue. But then sort of the real kind of thing that allows for the flexibility that we were looking at was this sort of reconfigurable set of objects in the center.
Yeah, so this is kind of just a diagram of the different ways that central piece of furniture, I'll call it, can be rearranged so that it works for different types of events. So, everything from a lecture to breakout groups to something where there's a performance going on in the center and you really just need seating around the edges. So that was really fun, I think. That was a really fun thing to work on and to puzzle out and to come up with a solution. I hope at some point we get to, put this into action, because I think it's a really interesting, I'd love to see it in action and being used. Yeah.
Right, and here's sort of a mock-up of a couple different configurations, one being used for, well, I guess that's more of, I don't know what's happening on the left, some social gatherings of some sort, more of just a place to gather and eat lunch or whatever, and then as a film screening on the right.
Oh, I'll go back for a second, because what I was going to say about this, just to kind of, like I said, this is a project that's been basically indefinitely suspended in a way. We built it for the DNC, but it doesn't mean it has to be specific for that. So I think we'll probably keep our eyes out for potential, future projects that this might be appropriate for. But one thing that was kind of nice is that recently we started talking with an artist named Leandra Lassour, who's based out of New Jersey. She won a fellowship.art grant last year, I guess. And one of the projects she wants to do in Milwaukee is a platforming project. So we introduced her to this design, and then based on, the energy and the ideas we had put into this design, she wants to collaborate with us on something. I won't say the design is going to be similar, but maybe the fabrication techniques, and certainly the fact that it's meant to be a platform for other performers and other people to come and create events and gatherings. So we're going to be, it's in early stages, so we don't have too much info yet. And then we just have a couple more pictures of just mock-ups of other designs that we are kind of starting to ruminate on. This is obviously another iteration of skew.
Yeah. How can we make it even more complicated is basically the question we're trying to answer here.
And what are other ways that buildings fail over time,
right.
I like this image. It may seem very abstract and sort of nothing, but I like it because it's a good example of how some, elaborate ideas can just start with really, really simple and basic sketches. And this is a project that we're kind of starting to talk about called the Soil Observatory. And it's meant to be basically you can walk down into the earth and then observe a dirt wall in front of you. And I'm starting to do research about the topsoil in the Midwest starting to disappear essentially because of wind erosion. So it might become something kind of timely and interesting to do.
Yeah, and also potentially a piece that shows up in multiple locations throughout the country or the world.
And then just last image, all of us posing on skew in a skewed fashion, just being silly. So So yeah, that's where we can leave things. And I guess it's already 7:23. I guess we went over, but if anyone has questions.
No, you didn't go over. We do have time for questions. So if anybody has any questions, you can either unmute yourself or type them in the chat box. I was kind of wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you both work together. Like, do you have similar roles? You have a variety of projects. Kind of how do you decide who does what? And can you talk a little bit about that?
That's a good question. And that's something that's kind of evolved over time, actually. Back when we were working like as the white box painters and doing those street performances and stuff, really everyone was kind of all working together, and we all had, you know, similar roles. We were all characters, you know, performing. It sort of divided up a little bit when it came to the documentation, because like I said, one of the members was a really good filmmaker and videographer and photographer, so he did a lot of that. But yeah, as time has gone on, Brent and I have realized that like kind of defining roles is actually a little bit more helpful and efficient for the types of things we do. So at this point, I would say all the ideation and kind of conceptual process, and sometimes the initial sketches and just loose ideas are super collaborative. Like we tend to work on that together quite a bit. I mean, we're married, we live together, so we're bouncing ideas all the time, you know? After hours, it's like there's no time that's off limits. And we travel together, and those are some of the times, you know, the times we get inspiration and really start talking about things. But when it comes down to actually starting to work on the projects, I've done everything from like managing, you know, doing project management type of stuff to like kind of coordinating things. We have done the fabrication together. We do a lot of the installation together, but then Brent and his team often are leading a lot of the, you know, in studio build out and the fabrication that happens in the studio. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We do have a comment. Great presentation. Loved your photos. So glad you have such good documentation.
Yeah.
What about some of the research that you do, either for like the white box painters characters or the pioneer characters that you talked a little bit about? Like, how do you develop your characters?
Mm-hmm.
I think like we have sort of a peculiar relationship to the pioneer characters. In some ways, the way we kind of think of them now is that they're sort of loosely based on our imagined ancestors. Okay, and I think that one of the things we've long sort of been interested in is the disparity between you know, history as it happened and our kind of perceptions of history.
And the retellings.
And in some ways the difficulty or perhaps impossibility of ever really understanding what actually took place. Because we have such sort of fragmented you know, collection of bits of evidence that we try to put together in order to create a coherent story. But in order to make it make sense, we're filling in all sorts of blanks. And when you fill in those blanks, it's reflecting your own biases, and so we're very interested in some ways even our own flawed perceptions of history. So we often intentionally don't research the things that we're presenting. I mean, I think in many ways we are steeped in this in researching this history because of our occupations. Because Shayna works at 2 historic house museums, and I work with the Chipstone Foundation, which has, you know, a collection of early American furniture and ceramics, and is very much steeped in historical research. And so we're surrounded by it, and all of that is influencing us. But I think we're equally like interested in the mistakes and the misperceptions, and our work kind of digs into that a little bit.
Yeah, and I think too, like, because we both do work with like scholarly historic institutions that are always really trying to find the facts, it's almost like we've realized that as artists, we can kind of dig into the other parts of that, which is all the unknowns, you know, that history offers, which I would go so far as to say the history is, or past is more unknown than it is known. So there's plenty of space there to explore.
Yeah, thank you.
Mhm.
I wondered if you you mentioned a little bit like with some of the examples, people's reactions to what you're doing. Do you have any other kind of memorable interactions that you could recall and tell us a little bit about?
Yeah, that's a good question. Trying to think.
Someone got really mad at us for the getting paint on their car after the when they ran over the white box painter's secret formula.
But little did they
But
know, it would just wash
off.
away. Yeah.
Okay.
We had a student at Myad ask us once for the formula,
Yeah, that's right.
and we had to respectfully decline.
Yes, it is a secret formula, and we have kept it secret. You know, I don't know if I can think of any like specific instances. I mean, one that I think Brent mentioned when we were doing that performance and installation on the water tower, I do specifically remember somebody coming up and saying, like, it's voting day, this is such a weird day to be painting the building. And I was like, that's not what we're doing. And but it was so illuminating, really, because I think just our, you know, our uniforms and the way we were like dressed, like I said, like municipal workers, it just sort of caused people to put us in their peripheral vision. And that was actually really interesting for us to take note of. So I would say, like, sometimes these reactions, like, I don't think of, nothing ever stands out to me as a reaction that was like, it made me angry or something. Usually when people approach what we do with confusion, it kind of opens up an opportunity for us to think about things in a different way, or, you know, get better at explaining things so people understand it. So yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, I had another question and now I've forgotten what it was.
That will happen.
But you know, if we don't have any other questions, I want to thank you both very much for your time and for sharing your work with us. I thought this was terrific. I learned a lot tonight, and thank you so much for doing this for us. And again, we will have it on our YouTube channel, and I can share that with people after we get it posted too.
That sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good evening.
Yep, have a good night.